It's time for Insights, a video news production of Deloitte LLP. Now here's your host, Sean O'Grady.
Hello and welcome to Insights. Every day, federal agencies are the targets of millions of cyber attacks, whether they know it or not. Today, we'll talk about how federal agencies can be more proactive in detecting and deterring threats and more resilient to the many faces of risk. Joining this broadcast remotely from Washington, D.C. are Linda Solomon and Omri Junadine. Linda is a principal with Deloitte Consulting and leads Deloitte's Homeland Security segment, which has served the Department of Homeland Security since its inception in 2003. Omri is a principal with Deloitte & Touche. He also leads the Federal Cybersecurity and Technology Risk Practices. And here with me in the studio is Ryan Brewer. Ryan was the Chief Information Security Officer and Director at Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, and he's now a Senior Manager with Deloitte & Touche. We're going to begin in D.C. with Omri. Omri, how has the cyber landscape changed, and what kinds of threats do you feel agencies are facing today?
The cyber landscape has changed a tremendous amount over the last several years. Number one, the pace and rate of technology adoption that federal government agencies are going through right now is tremendous. Whether you are talking about cloud computing, mobile computing, the adoption of social media as a tool that's being used in business, tremendous change there. Also, the complexity of government operating environments, including the sophistication of a global supply chain, I think that's another one. And the third item really is around the adoption of cybersecurity as being a mission imperative. So those would be the three primary changes in the landscape. And in terms of threats, I would put it into three categories. One is the threat from nation states. There are nation states out there every single day waiting to steal our secrets, whether it's secrets about an F-16 jet fighter or about some aspect of our critical infrastructure. Second is from the threat from the various criminal networks that exist all over the world, engaging in activities such as committing frauds on identity theft and things of that nature. And the third item is really around insider threat, the growing threat that comes from trusted insiders abusing their privileges to steal information and data.
Well, thank you very much for that, Omri. I'm going to bring it up here to New York and Ryan, who's sitting beside me. So you were the Chief Information Security Officer of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. What were some of the major challenges that your organization had to reduce and get away from to carry out your mission?
Right. Well, one of the main tipping points started quickly after I took the position at CMS, where we had a data call from the Department of Homeland Security. And after about 4 days of working with the teams, it was clear we didn't have a good grasp of how many data centers we had working on our behalf, the number of IT assets in those data centers. And so the strategy that we developed was quite simple. The first thing we had to do was figure out what do we actually have running on our networks in real time. And so we executed a plan over an 18-month period to map out the topologies of all of our infrastructures across around 100 data centers and then roll out an enterprise-wide vulnerability management program. That led us to know in real time how many assets we had on the network on a daily basis within all those data centers.
Now, it seems like to me that this landscape is changing every single day. So how can you plan to be proactive to fight cybersecurity issues?
Right. Well, it's very challenging, and a lot of organizations struggle with it, and we did at CMS. What you have to do is actually take the benefits of situational awareness and everything that you'll gather from that, and not only explain it in cybersecurity terms, but also translate that into business language. Right. You want to be able to present that to the executives in a way that they can digest it and it will resonate with them. That's the way you're going to be able to drive that change. Another key factor with that is leveraging all that continuous monitoring data. What you want to do is leverage that across the other programs so you can actually cut costs across those other programs. That's where you'll get a good return of investment for it.
Thank you very much for that, Ryan. I'd like to turn our attention back down to Washington, D.C. and to Linda. Linda, given the accelerating frequency and the intensity of cyber attacks, it seems like it's becoming more of a question of if, not when, a federal agency might be affected by these kinds of attacks. What steps do you see agencies taking to be more ahead and more resilient?
Thanks, Sean. And first, let me just say up front that the concept of staying ahead in cyberspace has a very limited time span, as I'm sure we can all imagine. And just to size the issue that our federal government faces, the Department of Homeland Security reported in 2010 alone, the federal government, all of its networks, experienced over 450,000 cyber attacks on average each month. That's 15,000 attacks a day. So, the issue is enormous. And the federal government certainly is intensifying its efforts in the whole cybersecurity space. DHS is playing a key role in driving this focus, specifically on the civilian side of the government. And, as you might imagine, as is the case with physical security, the whole concept of a multi-layered security approach is critical to addressing cyber attacks and putting the right type of security in place. I think there are three areas that the federal government continues to focus on. One, protecting against attacks that occur every day, the 15,000 attacks I just talked about. The federal government continues to expand the Einstein program, which is the early warning program that basically identifies unusual network traffic and patterns that allows security officials to identify and respond to potential threats. Two, the federal government is focused on and must continue to focus on identifying vulnerabilities, weaknesses in the system. Today, the federal government, for the most part, has been, faced with fighting this issue on an agency-by-agency basis. The federal government must come together in more of a collaborative fashion, look at the entire picture in terms of attacks, threats, best practices that are being employed, and develop a comprehensive strategy towards attacking cyber. Following lessons learned from DoD is critical in that regard. And then also, in terms of addressing vulnerabilities, really working with the private sector to make sure that a supply chain defense strategy is in place. And finally, we've got to anticipate future threats. The federal government's got to get better at doing that. They've got lots of data to use to perform analytics on. And that's going to help in terms of moving the needle, in terms of identifying what threats are likely to occur in the future.
Wow, Linda, 15,000 a day, that's clearly a very staggering number. I'm just interested to know, is throwing more technology at it the only solution, or are there other solutions to fending off these cyber attacks?
The simple answer, Sean, is no, technology is not enough. And like most efforts, beyond technology, people and culture play key roles. And I bet if you were to ask any federal agency today, what their top challenge is in terms of addressing this cyber security issue or topic, they're going to talk about the acquisition and development of skilled cybersecurity resources. It's a big problem. Federal agencies are working with universities and colleges to really help shape programs to ensure that the right people are getting developed and skilled in the whole cyber area. Beyond the people challenge, I think there's also an important kind of cultural challenge from the standpoint of everyone plays a role. Every employee in the federal government, every employee on the private sector side, every citizen in this country has to become more aware, has to take responsibility. We've got to take this topic seriously.
Linda, thank you very much for that. I'd like to return to Omri Junadine, who's there with you in the Washington Bureau. Omri, how do agencies keep cost reduction from undermining the cyber progress to date and cyber initiatives going forward? How do those costs and keeping those costs under control, how do they not influence the mission?
If you take a page from the book of the private sector, when we went through the Great Recession a few years ago, many private sector organizations, including those in the critical infrastructure area, had to basically do all kinds of creative things using technologies and all kinds of other techniques to again, use that concept of doing more with less, because that's the business reality. So let's talk about 2 or 3 specifics. One is, you're going to make sure that cybersecurity is tied to your mission and your mission objectives. By doing that, you basically protect some of the funding and keeps it on the front lines of somebody's attention span. The second thing is using all of the technological advances available to us from the variety of vendors that are out there to make sure that we've got the latest in technologies that can actually help us monitor cyber risks and cyber threats and help us actually do this better. And the third element that I would focus on is to make sure that we are focusing on risks that have the highest impact to the mission. The bottom line is, if everything is a focus, nothing is. So having a process in place to make sure you understand what your specific risks are that undermine your mission and your objectives, I think those are some ways that you can make sure that your cyber environment is protected, is safe, and also that you're basically able to do it with less resources. Because let's remember that any effective operating environment needs to have good cybersecurity. That way, you gain the trust and confidence of your stakeholders.
If everything is a focus, nothing is. Very interesting. I'd like to ask one last question. It's for all 3 of you, but I'd like to bring it here to New York with Ryan first, and that is, we've been talking about cyber and cybersecurity as it pertains to the federal agencies, the U.S. government, but really this appears like to be an issue that is growing, and it's not isolated to just the U.S. government. This is something that is global. So looking into that crystal ball, how do we continue to fight against this in 2020?
Right, it's a good question. I mean, if you're going to learn from anything in history, let's look back 10 years. We were faced with operating system and application level vulnerabilities. Well, guess what? We're still faced with those today. We still struggle with them. And the malicious actors are still going to take that low-hanging fruit if they have a chance to. It's a simple business decision. Another key point is something that Omri alluded to earlier, was that if you don't have a good understanding in real time of what your risks are within your organization, it's going to be really, really challenging for you to recover from that, from any type of cyber event. Cyber events are global, if we've seen that, so being able to recover from that is something you're going to have to work on by knowing where your risks are in real time.
Omri Junadeen, back to you down in Washington, D.C. How do you see cybersecurity in the next 10 years?
Wow, 10 years is almost a lifetime in this rapidly advancing technological world we live in. But if I can take my crystal ball out and think about that for a moment, number one, I think we need to have more adaptive risk management systems that actually at least tries to keep up with the adversaries and our enemies out there. Right now, the issue is that we're always playing catch up. I think Linda alluded to this earlier. So in 10 years, the first thing I would like to see is a more adaptive risk management environment where we are keeping up and perhaps even getting ahead of the threat environment. Number two, Linda also talked about culture change. That's really important. Global culture change as it relates to cybersecurity. Global cooperation among nations working together and actually helping solve this cybersecurity problem. And also, let's not forget that real trusted partnership between the private and public sector. And the third item, and last but not least, is how about some artificial intelligence? Perhaps some self-learning, adaptive technologies that basically identifies threats out there, figures out how to fix the problem with little to no human interaction.
And Linda, your final thoughts?
I'm going to come at this from a slightly different perspective. I actually believe that what gets measured gets done. And I actually think that one of the critical elements of the Go Forward plan as we march towards 2020 is going to be a uniform performance management system that we use as a nation to measure what we're accomplishing and understand where we're failing, where we need to take a different turn. That's got to be a focus of this effort. So I think you've heard the technical answer from my colleagues. I think it's also important to put the right performance measurements in place so that we can make sure that we are headed on the right path and solving this issue each and every day.
Well, thanks for that, Linda, and thanks to all of the guests for today's program. We've been talking risk and resiliency in the new cyber normal with Linda Solomon and Omri Junadine in Washington and Ryan Brewer here in New York. If you'd like to learn more about Linda, Omri, Ryan, or any of the topics discussed on today's broadcast, you can find that information on our website. It's Deloitte.com/InsightsUS. For all the good folks here at Insights, I'm Sean O'Grady. We'll see you next time.